Thank you very much indeed. Chief of the Air Force, it's a great pleasure for me to be here. It's an honour to be invited to this prestigious seminar. I much enjoyed coming here to lecture 2 years ago at the strategy seminar, and I'm really enjoying the quality of the talks and discussion that we've had today. The failure of the Allied campaign in Norway in 1940 is often attributed to two things. Firstly, the intelligence blunder that allowed the Germans complete strategic surprise in their coup de main invasion of the 9th of April. And secondly, the effect of German air superiority, or rather, more accurately, command of the air, which came to the Allies very much as what we would call today a revolution in military affairs, but of course it didn't come to the Germans in that way. But these reasons mask a factor which by itself could have resulted in the Allied defeat, and that is strategic muddle. Muddle, a slightly colloquial word in English, meaning disorder and confusion. So why was there this strategic muddle? What caused it, and what was its impact? And what does analysis of it tell us about the challenges of the conduct of good strategy today? In the next 25 minutes, I'll seek to answer these questions, drawing on my book, Analysis of a Campaign, and on my paper, The Political Military Dynamic in the Conduct of Strategy, which I delivered at that symposium 2 years ago. And I'm making an assumption here, which is that this audience is broadly familiar with the background and the events of the campaign in Norway in 1940. So what and why was there this strategic muddle? Firstly, at the outset of the war, there was in Britain the absence of a clearly laid down national or grand strategy, a formal approach to and plan for the conduct of the war. There were amongst decision makers a number of fairly commonly held principles or assumptions, some of which were written down. For example, what was called the long war strategy. The Allies were aware of their weakness relative to Germany, but believed that given time, their stronger economies could outperform Germany and thereby improve military strength and readiness. Time is emphatically on our side, they said. And this strategy sought to postpone major confrontation with Germany and look to a war of at least 3 years' duration. Other of these principles was the principle of building an alliance against Germany, the cornerstone of which was the Anglo-French alliance. But there was also an obvious need to attract more allies, notably the United States, while dissuading other countries, such as Italy, from joining Germany. Then there was the principle of safeguarding the British Empire, which for some people, possibly for Winston Churchill, was possibly the most important principle. Then there was avoiding the bloody attrition of the First World War on the Western Front. In Professor Sir Michael Howard's words, never again was not just an epitaph, it had become a guiding principle of strategy. And lastly, maintaining the moral high ground, abiding by international law, supporting vulnerable neutrals. For example, Norway, with the commitment of the 4th of September 1939, that any attack on Norway would be tantamount to attack on Britain itself, which was not, of course, entirely altruistic, because at the time Britain was seeking to negotiate use of the Norwegian merchant fleet, which was very generously given in November. There were thus a number of agreed individual policy objectives or strategic goals, but no formal document was produced, bringing all these principles and objectives together as a single agreed and endorsed strategy, and therefore no mechanism for the establishment of priorities between them. The War Cabinet did not commission such a paper to be written. The Chiefs of Staff commissioned a paper on the major strategy of the war, but not until the 8th of February, prompted by a much delayed paper by the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Arnside. However, it was not completed before the Norway campaign. A member of the War Cabinet, Lord Hankey, frustrated with this lack of strategy, himself produced his own paper, The Grand Strategy of the Alliance, and it was tabled at the War Cabinet on the 26th of March. But it was not discussed at this meeting. The Cabinet didn't discuss it, and there's a deep irony in this. It's as if the War Cabinet was saying, in effect, we don't have time for strategy, now's the time for decisions. Also at the grand strategic level was the Anglo-French Allied Supreme War Council. This council met 16 times between September 1939 and June 1940, but it never agreed an alliance strategy. Indeed, it never sought to, nor did it even ever discuss the subject of strategy, not once in 16 meetings. The Council only discussed subjects that both sides could agree on, the success of the meetings being judged on whether they were held in a cordial atmosphere rather than whether they discussed the important subjects and made the right decisions. And discussing strategy was potentially something that involved argument. At the military strategic level, there was also an absence of a coherent, overarching military strategy, and there wasn't quite the same clear delineation in those days between national strategy and military strategy. But it wasn't produced either in the Chiefs of Staff Committee or the committee that sat above it between the Chiefs of Staff and the Cabinet, which was called the Military Coordination Committee. Again, they agreed a number of strategic principles and approaches, such as the command of the seas and the oceans by the Royal Navy, deploying a British expeditionary force to France with government agreement to expand it up to 55 divisions, and the build-up and modernisation of the Royal Air Force aircraft, in particular fighters. But without an overarching grand strategy, there was no context for a military strategy, and none was produced before or during the Norway campaign. For the specific operation in Norway, in the absence of an operational or campaign level of command, planning took place either at the strategic level in the 3 separate armed forces ministries, with some wholly inadequate coordination from the tiny and overworked joint staff, or at the tactical level, over 200 miles away in the small headquarters of the divisional commander assigned to command the land forces. Thus, a number of separate operations were planned, but there was no campaign strategy coordinating them and sequencing them and thinking ahead, very much unlike in Germany. Not only was there an absence of strategies at each level, there were also deep flaws in consideration of strategy as a process. There was an assumption, both by ministers and their senior military advisors, that strategy as a process was simply the implementation of policy in a linear progression: policy, strategy, plans. Not that strategy as a process has a key function in balancing the ends to be achieved with the ways and means available, let alone that this process, to be responsive to circumstances, has to be ongoing and dynamic and iterative. To compound the error, the Chiefs of Staff had an over-literal interpretation of the principle of civilian primacy and did not see it as their place to enter into a discourse on the subject with ministers, let alone robust debate. This was unfortunate, particularly in view of Thomas E. Ricks's observation that one of the few predictors of how well a war will go is the quality of discourse between the civilian and the military leaders. One result of this absence of strategy was that without the context of an overarching strategy, strategic level discussion was not framed by strategy. And decisions, for example, in the lead up to the Norway campaign, although informed by strategic considerations, was not guided by a strategy, but driven by events and by public opinion and by political manoeuvring, by the something must be done syndrome, by eye-catching tactical proposals, or merely driven by the loudest voice in the room. Straws blown in the wind. And when it came to deployment and fighting, in the absence of strategy, tactics, as they have a habit of doing, developed a momentum all of their own. The degree of strategic model was compounded by a number of other factors, many of which I suggest are not unique to Britain in 1940, and I place them under three headings. Firstly, organisation and structural. First of these was the need for alliance cohesion, today would be called maybe coalition cohesion. And that, of course, was, as I mentioned, the Anglo-French alliance. The need to keep France alongside, and thus the need for compromise, sometimes to the prejudice of good strategy. Secondly, under this heading, the decision-making structure, an over-bureaucratic committee structure optimized for peace was formed. But it was hugely time-consuming in time of tension, the phony war, and occupied far too much of ministers and their senior military advisors' time, and became positively counterproductive in crisis management and war, proving itself far too unresponsive to fast-moving events. Then there was the lack of a joint force headquarters. Instead, there were three separate armed forces ministries where coordination came only at or near the top, with the chiefs of staff actually directing operations. So operational and tactical level decisions were made at far too high a level, out of touch with reality on the ground. For example, frequent sudden changes of plan, seemingly regardless of the military's ability to respond in time, resulting in order, counter-order, disorder, rather like a puppy chasing its tail. And there was no campaign, or what we'd call operational level of command, to focus on this campaign, an omission cruelly exposed when the German invasion on the Western Front in May gave the already hard-pressed staffs in the service ministries something else to think about. Secondly, under these headings, is personalities and personal relationships, because these organizations weren't just organizations, they were also organisms, where there were active relationships that drove events. Firstly, at the cabinet level, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had a war cabinet of only 9 people, but within it there were a lot of rivalries and divisions, although arguably no more divided than cabinets before and since. In addition, Neville Chamberlain was a good peacetime Prime Minister, but totally unsuited to leadership in war. For him, appeasement was not just a policy, but it was his style of leadership. Avoid confrontation or argument or unpleasantness. Seek consensus at almost any price. And he had a complete lack of knowledge of military affairs, as many senior ministers and prime ministers in many countries have to this day. Chamberlain's lack of knowledge of the military was so great, it wasn't that he didn't know the right answers, he didn't know the right questions to ask. Then there was his relationship with Churchill, who at that time was Minister for the Royal Navy. It was always an uneasy relationship, exacerbated by Churchill's, in many ways, admirable desire to take the fight to the enemy at the earliest opportunity, and his huge frustration with those who didn't share this desire. Churchill's bombastic and emotional style of argument and his great powers of advocacy were not, during this campaign, matched by his wisdom of judgment. The other members of the War Cabinet, too, had a limited understanding of strategy, and therefore too easily deferred to Churchill's apparent expertise and his powers of persuasion, or to Chamberlain's desire for consensus and compromise. Moreover, they seemed unable, or not confident enough, to cross-examine the Chiefs of Staff on strategic matters, and they were far more at ease and happier talking tactics, caricatured by an observer as playing with tin soldiers on a map. Then the Chiefs of Staff themselves were divided by inter-service rivalry, and they were over-deferential in their style towards a relationship with ministers, to whom they had an unwillingness to argue their case or present risk realistically, or to admit the unpreparedness of the armed forces. General Ironside himself, when talking about the huge unpreparedness of the British Army, wrote in his diary at night, "When it is discovered there might be a row, the blame may well fall upon the soldiers." So he didn't represent the case in cabinet. There was also friction between the Chiefs of Staff, who themselves were intellectually not out of the top drawer, and their immediate subordinate advisors, who were the Joint Planning Staff, whose advice they often ignored or summarily dismissed because they were junior. Because we're senior, we must know best. Then third amongst these categories is cultural. There was firstly a peacetime mentality in government during the planning phase, during the phony war. For example, everybody in government in London worked peacetime hours of work, 9 till 5. Ministers, although not Churchill, carried on with their practice of weekending at their country estates or wherever they went. So things happened slowly. Then there was an underestimation by both the Chiefs of Staff and some ministers of the capability of the German military, quite contrary to the intelligence advice they were getting. And there's more than a whiff of arrogance and complacency about this. Then there was singularly the low level of knowledge of the Norwegian military. There was no military attaché, for example, in Oslo. And a huge underestimation of the Norwegian military capability, and a complete failure to plan, or when it came to it, fight, a combined campaign with Norwegian forces at either the strategic or operational, or indeed tactical levels. And for some senior British military officers, this came from a patronising or condescending attitude. Then there was a gross underestimation of Clausewitzian friction, the only concept that more or less corresponds to the factors that distinguish real war with war on paper. For British political decision makers had come to regard the two as much the same thing, and their senior military advisors should have prevented this. Then there was the culture of wishful thinking. This culture had developed in the cabinet and spread from outside it. Undue optimism, grossly overinflated optimism, which denigrated those who emphasized risk as pessimists and defeatists. It was infectious, and in such a culture it required moral courage to talk risk. And lastly was the culture of improvisation. From the earliest stages of planning, the British tended to rely on ad hoc solutions. A reverence for flexibility, adaptability, and empiricism had crossed the line into undue faith in improvisation. The British called playing it off the cuff, was actually no more than muddling through. Improvisation became not a part of, but a substitute for strategy and sound planning and doctrine. So what was the impact of this strategic muddle? Well, I'll just give you a few examples. After the Finnish surrender on the 12th of March, there was no reappraisal of strategy. There was no strategy to reappraise. The British forces already embarked for Narvik were disembarked, dispersed, and the special units, such as the ski battalion, disbanded. And it was not made clear whether the expedition might at some future stage be required. Contradictory assumptions were made. For example, the War Office ordered all written plans to be destroyed for security reasons, and even for the Scandinavian Planning Branch in the War Office to be disbanded. Yet just a fortnight later, the War Cabinet suddenly ordered the plans to be resurrected and the force to be deployed in little over a week's time. The Chiefs of Staff who were present at the meeting knew but failed to point out that this was just not feasible. The ways and means no longer existed. It would take weeks or months to make an effective force ready. To proceed as suggested would therefore carry astronomical risk. But they said nothing. And any ministers who might have shared their doubts either kept quiet or put it from their minds. Then another example, the War Cabinet not addressing strategy coherently, tending to focus on tactics, what to do next. This permeated downwards. A senior officer at Harstadt caricatured the campaign strategy as, let's attack here, let's go there, and if anyone else has a good idea, let's go there too. Churchill's personal obsession with Narvik, he called it in his book on the Second World War, my pet love. He had become obsessed with Narvik. It was emotional and persuasive, but completely illogical. He'd subsumed strategy to tasks. Then on the 9th of April, the impact of shock and awe in London. The impact of this on strategic level decision-making, a failure to think strategically. For example, prioritising action at Narvik over Trondheim. With no context of a strategy, discussion focused on what to do next, rather than on what tactical action was required and available that would achieve strategic objectives. Then there was the failure to maintain the aim, present throughout the campaign. On the 10th of April, dispatching a task force to Harstadt with separate and contradictory orders for the naval and military commanders, and no overall commander, and separate chains back to government ministries. Then the diversion to Trondheim of one of the ships carrying a brigade in mid-voyage to Narvik. Churchill chairing that military coordination committee, browbeating the chiefs of staff in late-night, acrimonious, alcohol-fueled meetings into decisions against their better judgment, including last-minute, kaleidoscopic changes of plan. On the 15th of April, sending semi-trained territorial army reserve brigades to Namsos and Åndalsnes, with no realistic consideration of the feasibility of these troops, no balancing of the ends to be achieved with the ways and means available, or any attempt to fight jointly with Norwegian forces, or even to keep them informed. And very poor coordination between the British services, especially the air support to the ground forces. Uncoordinated, again, completely unlike the Germans. Then the 31st of April, after the evacuation from central Norway, a failure of that war cabinet to adjust strategy in the new circumstances. Instead, as the minutes show, war cabinet discussion centred on saving face, on avoiding blame, and on how they were going to handle the media. Sounds familiar. And then on the 10th of May, after the German invasion of France, no review of strategy or prioritisation between the campaigns in Norway and the campaign in France. There was no strategy to review. No coordination whatsoever between the British forces at Harstad and the British and Norwegian forces south of Narvik, delaying the German advance north. The British forces were deployed south without realistic appraisal of balancing the ends, ways and means. Inter-service disharmony, the Royal Air Force covertly choosing to minimise support to the campaign in Norway without informing anybody, concerned about preserving their strength, the air defence of Great Britain. And then belated establishment of an intermediate operational level headquarters, but in the middle of the campaign, without any proper resources, for example, staff or equipment or communications, merely adding to the muddle. There are many more of those examples, but I'm going to go straight to conclusions, of which I have 4. The first is that poor strategy at the grand military and campaign or operational levels was a major factor in the outcome of the campaign, that even without the intelligence blunder and German command of the air, it could have been terminal. Secondly, having a strategy at whatever level is obviously highly important. But to be effective, it must be flexible to events and circumstances, and it must be used to frame discussion and guide action. As too often happens, it's no use whatsoever if it's merely a box-ticking exercise. Third, an essential point for starting for practitioners is that, and practitioners both military and civilian, is that there must be that rare thing, a common understanding of strategy, not least the meaning of the word. And I can assure you that in the UK today, if you ask members of the British Cabinet their definition of strategy, you get exactly the same number of definitions as there are members of the Cabinet. And there has to be recognition that strategy as a process is ongoing, dynamic, and iterative, and that it requires relentless focus on balancing the ends to be achieved with the ways and means available, and on assessing and mitigating risk. Finally, good strategy is elusive. There are many factors which conspire to make it so, particularly at the higher levels, particularly in a democracy, and particularly within a coalition or alliance facing a dictatorial single state. Indeed, in such circumstances, it is far easier for bad strategy to result. So the final point is that understanding and appreciating this is critical to prevent it happening. Thank you very much.